remaining did what we could to remind ourselves we were human. Susan and I found each other, fell in love. We both wanted to forget the past. We vowed to stop fighting and start living. I kept that vow as long as I could.
Resistance 3 is the final game in the Resistance series, the trilogy of first-person shooters set in an alternate timeline where Earth has been invaded by an alien race known as the Chimera. Released in 2011, Resistance 3 was developed for the PlayStation 3 exclusively by Insomniac Games. So, for a quick recap, the Chimera brought along with them a horrible virus that infects those who come into contact with it, turning them into Chimeran foot soldiers in a sort of bizarre symbiosis with human DNA. These are referred to in-game as hybrids, and different varieties of these hybrids form the enemy lineup for each of the games. But if you're familiar with the series, then that means you already know all of this, which means you also know the setup for Resistance 3. Now, if you haven't played any of the prior games, then you can expect this video to spoil more than a few things. Like, for instance, how the protagonist, Joseph Capelli, is the very same man who killed Hale in the second game's finale. Doing the moral and truly merciful thing, Joseph executed Hale after he was infected by the Chimeran virus to save him from himself, but was however discharged from the military for his conduct. Now look, Joseph, I think if you told people what happened, they would have understood. I mean, Hale was notoriously ignorant about not taking his medicine, and everyone could tell just by looking at the guy that he was losing his marbles. The glowing eyes and scaly skin was really the biggest giveaway, but anyway, that's the plot and that's what's happened. Now when the third game picks up, Joseph is now living with a group of survivors with his wife and kid. The story continues years after the events of Resistance 2 when a cure for the virus has been found. However, the Chimera are still strong as an opposing force, and humanity is relegated to hiding underground and staying out of sight. But not for much longer. Dr. Malikov returns and claims he has figured out a way to defeat the Chimera once and for all, and that Joseph must accompany him to New York City to do so. It's not the worst premise, though. The issue is that Joseph really seems like he's kind of been thrown in as the protagonist by default. I never really gave two shits about this guy in the previous game, and the only thing making him memorable was the fact that he killed Hale in the finale. But like him or not, he's here to stay. It's a bit of a shame there's not really many layers to his character. The only emotion he ever really shows is when he's lamenting the absence of his wife or daughter. He's a pretty standard FPS grunt protagonist otherwise, not incredibly deep, but still not all that boring either. He's just here to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and he's all out of gum. Now, Resistance 1 and 2 had a great variety of missions and environments, but suffered from some poor gameplay and design choices, the second game in particular. Resistance 3, however, doesn't fall prey to really any of this. This is in a lot of ways a return to form for the series. There's no more regenerating health, and we've also got the return of the old weapon wheel, allowing you to hold every single available gun at any one time. Just on this alone, Resistance 3 is leaps and bounds better than the second game, and as good if not better than the first. A cool new feature is how you're able to upgrade your weapons if you use them enough in the field. Now the way this works is that after making a certain amount of kills, they can be leveled up a total of 2 times, giving them increased damage or a better zoom on the scope for instance. This is great at kind of forcing you to experiment with different weapon types and rewards you for doing so by giving you a new perk. Again, the weapons are just very well designed and great fun to use, from the carbine rifle through to the Bullseye. They all look and sound fantastic. The designs of each weapon is easily one of the series' strongest points, and something you can't really argue with. I'd have to say the Crygun is my personal favourite, freezing enemies in place with the primary fire, combined with a secondary fire that shoots out a shockwave, shattering them instantly. Once again, the Auger still stands out as the best of the bunch, allowing you to throw out a protective shield and giving you the ability to fire through walls. Overall, the shooting is fantastic, and the added bonus of being able to upgrade all these guns the more you use them gives you an incentive to play around with them and actually use weapons you'd normally not bother with, increasing the depth and replayability from combat. In terms of the level design, it's largely linear, though the areas you fight in are often quite open-ended, giving you lots of freedom to overcome each battle. Sometimes you're thrown into cramped quarters and come up against lots of faster enemy types, but these sections aren't as prevalent as they were in Resistance 2. Where Resistance 3 really offers up its originality is the journey that it kind of takes you on, and it's something we never really saw in the prior games. There's a unique chapter later in the game where you run across a bandit group that attacks and ultimately kidnaps Joseph, and it's really the first time in the series that they've shown what other groups of humans, those not constantly engaged in fighting against the Chimera, have been getting up to. Similarly, an earlier section has you helping out a bunch of survivors called the Remnants, again simply people who've hunkered down and tried to get on with their lives. It's a nice change of pace considering every single other character you met or dealt with in the other games was an enlisted soldier type of person who was always taking orders and served some sort of function in a purely militaristic sense. To come across people just making it on their own the only way they can is a lot more realistic and intriguing than just characters who talk in military jargon or are just basic archetypes to fill some sort of support role.
We fight or we die. I'm guessing by virtue of the fact you're still breathing, you were one of the fighting type.
There's lots of incredible set pieces and scripted events where you're running around these environments and all hell is breaking loose around you, and they're just incredible to witness. And it's the kind of thing the other games touched on but never really achieved. In terms of the overall campaign, Resistance 3 sits somewhere in the middle. It's not quite as hard as the other two games, but it's also easily the shortest. I found myself dying far less than any of the other games combined, and the levels move at a really brisk pace, constantly changing the backdrop and mixing up the pacing of what it is you're doing mission to mission. The pacing overall just feels a lot smoother and more refined. You're rarely stuck on one section, retrying it over and over for various reasons, and normally around the time you get sick of a location is often when the game mixes it up and throws you into an entirely new area along with a new mechanic to deal with. Like, say, avoiding sniper rounds in a forest at night time before finding yourself inside a narrow, derelict mine passage and fleeing from an incredibly powerful chimeran leaper that can only be killed by detonating explosive tanks inside its mouth. Don't get me wrong, there's still some problematic areas. Insomniac Games just couldn't help adding in one of those areas where you're up against horde-style enemies. In Resistance 3, you're in a town infested with those skinny, zombie-type enemies, and again, these sections are often irritating and cheap. But thankfully they're over quickly and trumped by just how solid the rest of the campaign truly is. It's just a fascinating and tightly crafted single player experience, and there is very little here to complain about. It flows incredibly well and the pacing is just leaps and bounds better than anything else we've seen in the other two games. Is it perfect? Well, that's a good question, Sonny Jim. I guess one thing that does kind of irk me about this game is the visuals. Well, maybe not irks, but it kind of confuses me. Let me explain. When I played this on my TV, it looked pretty damn good. In fact, I was actually surprised when I loaded it up and saw how nice it was. There's a huge amount of detail in the environments from the different weather and other atmospheric effects, and the weapon and character models also look really good. Sound and music is fantastic, and it was just very cinematic as I sat on my couch and let all of these different elements of the presentation just bombard me. But after capturing footage for it and looking at it on my PC, it looks almost blurry and there's like a weird hazy effect over the image. I have a really expensive capture card, so I don't think this is the issue, but it just seems that the game is a bit mixed in terms of its visuals. It's not a huge thing when you consider that the second game was very much pushing the console to its limits anyway. At the end of the day, this is a great game in a very noteworthy franchise. Resistance 1 was a solid game, followed by Resistance 2, which just took the series in the wrong direction, before Resistance 3 has finally returned and set it back on the right track, and for the most part, this game gives us a very satisfying ending to the series. I think it's hard to find a trilogy of games that are all equally loved. I mean, look at something like Max Payne or the Mass Effect trilogy. People are always going to love or hate different things in each game. As the saying goes, it's not how you start, it's how you finish, and Resistance 3 manages to pick up the pieces from Resistance 2 and tie everything together, to my amazement. If Resistance 2 hadn't bogged everything down, we would have truly had an amazing, dare I say it, masterpiece with Resistance 3, but on the whole, this is a solid entry of games, and I would say that the third game is easily one of the best shooters available on the PlayStation 3 console, and just a pretty damn good FPS game in general.